A rancher puts his wife in the ground at sunrise. By sundown, a stranger is sleeping in her bed. Her name was Sarah. His is Emmett Sloan. The dirt from her grave was still packed under his nails when he walked back into the house that was no longer a home. It was just a box of wood holding 20 years of silence. The air inside should have smelled of soap and lamp oil, the way it always had, the way she always had. Instead, a new scent hung in the shadows: damp earth and smoke. He stopped dead in the bedroom doorway. The quilt, the one Sarah had stitched with those strange, wandering patterns, was pulled up to the chin of a girl. Dark hair, black as a raven's wing, spilled across his wife's pillow. Her chest rose and fell in the slow, deep rhythm of true exhaustion. She was young, maybe 20. Her face was hollowed out by hunger, her skin dusted with the grit of a long road. And on her wrist, a raw red mark where a rawhide bond had been tied. Cut away in a hurry, clutched in her hand, held tight against her ribs even in sleep, was a single eagle feather. Its quill was smeared with something dark. Blood. Emmett had buried a life that morning. Now, another had slipped in to take its place, breathing where no one should be. Grief is a cold thing. But this was a fire. Who was this girl? And what kind of trouble had she brought to a house already drowning in sorrow? She woke up like a deer at the snap of a twig. 1 second, she was asleep. The next, she was on her feet, the quilt falling to the floorboards. She didn't scream. A sound, sharp and tight, caught in her throat. Her eyes were wide, black, and full of a fire that hadn't been banked by exhaustion. She put 10 feet of empty space between them, not 9, not 11, exactly 10. A distance measured by instinct. Her whole body was a coiled spring ready to bolt. Emmett raised his hands, palms open, the same way he'd gentle a spooked horse. "Easy now," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rougher than he'd intended. The girl didn't relax. Her gaze was locked on his, reading him, weighing him. She spoke one word. It was sharp, clipped, in a language he didn't know. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A prayer or a warning, he couldn't tell which. She shifted her weight, ready to run, but she never broke that 10-foot circle. It was a law. Her law. Close enough to see the threat, far enough to escape it. He could feel the power of that invisible line. He didn't step forward. He stepped sideways, toward the window. He wanted to give her a clear path to the door. She didn't take it, and that's when he saw it. Through the dusty glass, in the fading light, he saw the yard. It was a map of her fear, tiny footprints in the dust, circling the house, over and over, always keeping that same careful distance from the walls. A perfect, unbroken ring. The truth hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't just arrived. She'd been out there for days, watching, waiting, held back by a rule he couldn't understand. Now she was inside, her dark eyes asking a silent question. Was he the kind of man her people had warned her about? Or was he something else entirely? The morning sun bled across the horizon, turning the gray sky to rust. Emmett hadn't slept. He'd spent the night on the porch, his rifle across his knees, listening. The house behind him was quiet. The girl was inside, wrapped in Sarah's quilt, silent as a shadow. He didn't know why he hadn't just told her to leave. Maybe it was the scars on her wrists. Maybe it was the bloody feather. Or maybe it was the ghost of his wife, a woman who'd spent a lifetime collecting strays. Then he heard it. The steady beat of shod hooves on the eastern trail. His gut twisted into a cold knot. Marshal Kellerman rode at the head of the group. He sat his horse like he was carved from the same stone as the mountains, his face a mask of hard lines and suspicion. Behind him rode 4 men, their faces blank, their eyes holding the flat, empty look of men who tally sins like they're counting coin. They were bounty hunters, hiding behind the marshal's star. They reined in, the creak of leather loud in the morning stillness. "Morning, Sloan," Kellerman's voice was like gravel scraping rock. Heard tell of some strange tracks out this way. Emmett rose slowly from the porch steps. He kept his hands in sight. Only tracks I've seen are my own, Marshal. Kellerman's gaze swept the yard, the cabin, lingered on the door. He was a man who didn't just look. He dissected. He flicked two fingers, and a lean, pale-eyed man named Briggs swung down from his saddle. Briggs moved like a weasel, all silent grace and predatory instinct. He crouched, his fingertips barely brushing the dust near the well. He didn't even look up when he spoke. His voice was flat, final. 3 nights running, same pattern. Circling the house, never gets closer. Small feet, light, Apache. He paused, then his pale eyes flicked up to meet Emmett's. That ain't no drifter, that's a scout. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. The other men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to their rifles. A scout meant a war party wasn't far behind. That was the story they told themselves. It was the story that let them sleep at night. Kellerman spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Scout means the rest are coming. Raiders don't send one alone for a social call. His eyes, hard as iron nails, pinned Emmett to the porch. You seen anything, Sloan? Emmett held his gaze. He could feel the girl's presence behind the thin wooden wall, a silent, listening terror. Not a soul, he lied. And then the men started talking numbers, the way butchers talk about cattle. $50 for a scalp, double for a warrior, less for a woman, even less for a child. They were carving up a family that might not even exist, turning lives into columns in a ledger book written in blood. Emmett's stomach churned, the lie he'd told sitting like a stone in his gut. Inside, behind the door, he knew a pair of dark eyes were watching, listening, and understanding that for men like these, her life was worth less than the bullets it would take to end it. The afternoon sun baked the dust in the yard. The marshal and his men were gone, for now their promises to return hanging in the air like a threat. Emmett knelt by the water trough, a stick in his hand. The girl, Ayanna, she'd finally whispered her name, crouched on the other side. She still wore the quilt like a shield. Her eyes, which had been wide with terror, were now sharp with a wary intelligence. She was a survivor. He was beginning to understand that. He drew a clumsy shape in the dirt, a house. She watched him, her head tilted. Then she took the stick from his hand. Her movements were precise. She smoothed the dirt flat and drew the same house. Then she drew a circle around it. She tapped her chest, then tapped the circle. Then she tapped him and tapped the dot that was the house. She repeated it. Circle, dot. Her finger stopped. She spoke one word, her tongue shaping the English carefully. Safe. It wasn't a question. It was a definition. Her circle was safety. His house was the center of it. A law, passed down through generations. Close enough to watch, far enough to run. He understood. Then she began to draw again. A series of winding lines, like trails through a canyon. Her finger traced one of the paths. Then she paused. She reached out and touched the quilt draped over her shoulders. She pointed to a specific pattern stitched in faded blue thread. Emmett leaned closer. His breath caught in his throat. It was the same pattern, the same turns, the same crossings. The strange design he'd watched Sarah sew for countless nights. The one he'd always thought was just some random pretty thing. It wasn't random. It was a language. A map. Ayanna tapped the stitching on the quilt. Then she tapped the map in the dust. Safe, she said again, pointing at a symbol on the quilt. Then she pointed to another. Warning. She looked up at him, her dark eyes burning with an intensity that staggered him. Same, she whispered. Safe, warning, same. The world shifted on its axis. His wife. His quiet, gentle Sarah. She hadn't been just a rancher's wife making pretty quilts. She had known. She had been stitching Apache trail signs into her work. messages hidden in plain sight, right there in his own bed for years, and he had been completely, utterly blind. This girl, Ayanna, hadn't found his house by accident. She'd been following a map made of thread, a map that led to a safe house run by a woman who was now in the ground, a woman who had secrets deeper and darker than he could have ever imagined. The first wisp of smoke appeared just after noon, a thin gray finger rising from the distant ridges, so straight and steady it couldn't be a brush fire. It was a signal. Emmett saw it from the porch, and his blood ran cold. He'd seen smoke signals before, messages written on the sky. Kellerman and his men, who had set up a cold camp at the edge of his property, saw it too. The marshal strode into his yard, a smug look on his hard face. "There they are, Sloan. Just like I said, the scout calling in the war party." He gestured to his men. "Time to ride, time to earn our pay." The bounty hunters stirred, a pack of wolves catching a scent. To them, that smoke was a dinner bell. It meant money in the hills, ready for the taking. But behind Emmett, in the doorway of the cabin, Ayanna stood perfectly still. Her face was tilted towards the sky, her expression unreadable. But it wasn't fear he saw. It was something else. Contempt. She whispered a word in her own tongue, a sound like a stone striking flint. Then she looked at Emmett, her eyes blazing. "Not call," she said, her English thick with urgency. "Trap." Emmett turned to face her. "Trap?" She darted forward, grabbing a piece of charcoal from the cold hearth. She crouched and drew in the dust of the porch, a single straight line for the smoke signal. Then, all around it, she drew a circle of dots. She tapped each dot, her meaning clear. Men. Hiding. Waiting. Her eyes locked on his. "Bait," she hissed. The ugly truth settled in his gut like poison. Kellerman and his kind hadn't just been hunting. They had been studying. They had learned the language of their prey. They'd taken a sacred signal, a call for help, a message between families, and they had twisted it. They had turned a symbol of community into a lure. A crooked promise designed to draw desperate people out of hiding and into the sights of their rifles. What was once a lifeline was now a noose. Ayanna's hand gripped his arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. She pointed to the drawing in the dust, then back to the rising smoke. "Bait," she said again, her voice shaking with a rage that was centuries old. The smoke climbed higher, a clean line against the brilliant blue sky. A beautiful, deadly lie. And Emmett understood that to ride towards it wasn't to meet a war party. It was to walk straight into an ambush, a slaughterhouse designed by the very men who claimed to be keeping the peace. The canyon was a wound in the earth, a narrow slit of red rock that twisted deep into the foothills. The walls were so high they choked the sunlight, leaving the canyon floor in a perpetual, watchful twilight. Emmett knew this place. He'd tracked a wounded buck in here once and found a hidden spring, and something else. A second exit, a crack in the rock wall, barely wider than a man's shoulders, a secret door for those who knew to look. He led Ayanna towards it now, their steps muffled by the sand and silence. Behind them, they heard the thunder of hooves. Kellerman and his men stormed into the main entrance of the canyon, their voices loud and arrogant, echoing off the stone walls. They thought they had their prey cornered. Through the narrow slit in the rock, Emmett and Ayanna watched them. The posse fanned out, their rifles ready. They found what they were expecting to find. A recently used fire pit, the gnawed bones of a rabbit, signs of a camp broken in a hurry. Briggs, the tracker, knelt in the dust. "They were here," he called out, his voice flat. "Recent. Maybe only a few hours." The other men grew excited, their bloodlust rising. They were close. They could taste the kill, but Emmett wasn't looking at the fire pit. He was looking at the canyon walls. There were markings carved into the rock. Some were old, faded by wind and rain. But there were fresh ones, too. Pale gouges of red stone, sharp and clear against the darker, weathered surface. They weren't random scratches. They were symbols, warnings, Ayanna saw them too. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingertips tracing the lines. Her face wasn't fearful. It was a mask of grim recognition. Generations of her people had left messages here, each new warning carved over the old ones, a chorus of voices screaming across time: danger, turn back, ambush, death. Then Ayanna froze. Her finger stopped on one of the newer carvings, a crude drawing of a man with a star on his chest and a face like a hawk. Kellerman. Next to it, another figure, lean and thin, like a snake. Briggs. This wasn't just a general warning, it was a wanted poster, a testament to past crimes. Kellerman and his men had used this canyon before. It was their personal killing ground. Emmett felt the cold stone at his back. The canyon wasn't a trap for the Apache. It was a trap set by the lawmen. They used the smoke to lure people in, and the canyon to finish them off, where there were no witnesses. A perfect, repeatable slaughter. Behind him, Kellerman's men prowled through the shadows, hunting ghosts, convinced of their own righteousness. But Emmett now knew the chilling truth. This canyon had two mouths, and Kellerman was standing in the jaws of the one that was about to snap shut. They didn't go back to the ranch right away. They couldn't. Kellerman would be watching it. Instead, Ayanna led him high into the rocky crags, to a place where the wind howled and the world fell away below. A shallow cave, hidden behind a curtain of ancient junipers, offered shelter. They shared the last of his jerky and watched the sun set, painting the clouds in shades of blood and fire. The silence between them was no longer one of fear, but of shared understanding. They were in this together now. That night, Ayanna finally spoke. Not in broken English, but in a steady, quiet voice. She told him about her village. It wasn't a war party. It was families. Old people. Children. Driven from their lands, hunted for the bounties on their heads. They had been trying to reach a sanctuary, a hidden place whispered about in stories, a safe haven promised by a network of sympathizers. A network that used quilts as maps. She told him about the woman they called the Weaver. A white woman with kind eyes and hands that were never still, who stitched paths to freedom in her quilts and left them in prearranged drop points. Ayanna's family had been following the last map, a map that led them to Emmett's ranch when they were ambushed. Not by Kellerman, but by another gang of scalp hunters. She alone had escaped, carrying the quilt and the blood-marked feather, a prayer feather from her grandfather, stained with his blood when he fell. She had been circling the ranch for 3 days, waiting for the signal the Weaver had taught her. A single lantern, left burning in the west window after sundown, but the lantern never appeared, because Sarah was already dead. Emmett listened, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the rage building inside him. His wife hadn't just been helping people. She had been a soldier in a secret war, and he, her husband of 20 years, had been sleeping next to her, completely oblivious. The quilt, Ayanna explained, was more than a map. It was a key. Certain patterns corresponded to certain safe houses, but one pattern was different. A complex, star-like shape in the very center. The heart of the spider's web, Ayanna whispered, the meeting place, where all the trails end. But she didn't know where it was. Only the Weaver knew that. The location wasn't on the map. It was a secret Sarah had carried to her grave. A wave of despair washed over Emmett. The one person who could lead them to true safety was gone. They were cut off. Adrift. Ayanna fell silent, her story told. She curled up in the quilt, the map to a place they could no longer find, and fell into a troubled sleep. Emmett stayed awake, staring into the darkness, the weight of his wife's secret life and her secret failure pressing down on him like a tombstone. The final sanctuary was lost, and Kellerman was still out there, hunting. They returned to the ranch under the cover of a moonless night, moving like ghosts through the familiar landscape. The house felt violated, tainted by Kellerman's presence. While Ayanna kept watch, her eyes scanning the dark horizon, Emmett went straight to the bedroom. He took the quilt from the bed, his hands surprisingly gentle. He carried it to the kitchen table and spread it out under the dim light of a single lamp. He found the star pattern in the center, the heart of the web. He ran his fingers over the intricate stitching, feeling the love and patience his wife had poured into it. But he also felt something else, a slight thickness, a subtle stiffness in the fabric that wasn't present anywhere else on the quilt. His heart began to pound. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a pocket. With the tip of his knife, he carefully, painstakingly sliced the threads. One by one, he opened the seam his wife had so carefully closed. The cloth parted, and inside, nestled within the soft cotton batting, was a small, oilskin pouch. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside wasn't a map, it was a book, a small ledger. He opened it. The first page was a list of names, Apache names. Next to each name was a date and a place, and next to that, a name he recognized. Sarah Sloane. It was a record, a log of every person she had helped guide to safety. Dozens of them. Men, women, children. A secret history of defiance and compassion written in his wife's neat, steady hand. He turned the page, and the next, and the next. He saw the name of Ayanna's grandfather. Then he saw other names he recognized. People from the surrounding territories who had vanished. The official story was always that they had run off or been killed in raids. The truth was, right here, Sarah had saved them. He flipped to the last page. There were 2 entries. The first was Ayanna's family, marked as in transit. The second entry made his blood turn to ice. It was a name he knew all too well. Briggs. Next to the name was a note. Compromised. Turned. Now rides with K. Briggs, the quiet, pale-eyed tracker, wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was one of them. Someone Sarah had tried to help, who had betrayed her and her entire network to Kellerman. Briggs knew the system. He knew the signs. He knew about the quilts. He wasn't just hunting Apache. He was hunting the remnants of the network, tying up loose ends. And the biggest loose end was the girl sleeping in the next room, and the man who was now holding the evidence of it all in his hands. The ledger was a death warrant, for Kellerman, for Briggs, and for him. Dusk settled like a shroud, the sky bruised purple and black. Emmett worked with a frantic, focused energy. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was the keeper of his wife's legacy. He was the guardian of her secrets. Guided by Ayanna, who now understood the ranch was not a destination but a waypoint, he turned the yard into a weapon. Not a killing field, a warning. He used the skills his father had taught him for trapping coyotes and wolves. Shallow pits hidden with a dusting of soil. Tripwires made from thin leather cord, tied not to guns, but to stacks of old tin cans that would raise a clatter. He dug a deep trench, a horse stopper, along the eastern approach, the one Kellerman favored, and covered it with brittle branches. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was trying to slow them down, to tell them, in a language of rope and earth, that this ground was no longer neutral. Then he saw them, silhouettes on the ridge, Kellerman, Briggs, and their pack. They weren't riding hard this time. They were coming slow, deliberate. They fanned out, forming a semicircle, cutting off all escape. This wasn't a raid. It was a siege. Emmett stepped onto the porch. He didn't lift his rifle. He let it hang in the crook of his arm, barrel pointed at the ground. Ayanna was inside, the ledger tucked securely into her bindings, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She had the back window open, ready to slip out and run for the broken country to the west the moment he gave the signal. Kellerman reined in his horse just at the edge of the yard, a good 20 yards from the porch. His eyes, even from this distance, were sharp, calculating. He wasn't looking at Emmett. He was looking at the ground, at the faint, almost invisible disturbances in the dust. He knew. "Sloane!" His voice cut through the twilight. "You've had your time to mourn. I know she's in there. Send the girl out now. No one has to get hurt." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Briggs rode up beside him, his pale eyes scanning the yard with an unnerving intensity. He pointed a long finger, not at one of the traps, but at the porch post. "That knot, Marshal," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. "On the railing, the decorative one." Emmett glanced at it. It was a knot Sarah had tied years ago, a complex looping thing she called a weaver's knot. She said it brought good luck. Kellerman stared at the knot. A flicker of something, confusion, then dawning horror, crossed his face. Briggs spoke again. She used that same knot on the supply caches. It was her signature, her mark. The silence that followed was absolute. Kellerman wasn't just facing a rancher protecting a fugitive anymore. He was facing the ghost of the woman he'd underestimated. The Weaver. He now understood that the woman he had dismissed as a quiet, mousy wife had been playing a deadly game right under his nose for years. And this ranch wasn't just a home. It was the center of her web. Kellerman's hand slowly moved towards his pistol. "It doesn't matter, Sloane. It ends tonight. Her story and yours." Emmett slowly raised his rifle, the cold stock settling against his shoulder. "You're wrong, Marshal," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's just beginning." He had bought Ayanna the time she needed. He heard the faintest scuff of a boot on the dirt behind the house. She was gone. Now it was just him and the wolves. The first shot wasn't from Kellerman. It was from Briggs. The tracker was fast, his pistol clearing leather in a blur. The bullet splintered the porch post right next to Emmett's head. Emmett didn't flinch. He already had his target. He fired once, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. The shot wasn't aimed at Kellerman, but at the ground right in front of his horse. The big bay screamed and reared, throwing the surprised marshal into the dust. Chaos erupted. Two of the other bounty hunters charged forward, firing wildly. Their first steps took them right into the yard. A tripwire snapped. A tower of tin cans came crashing down with a deafening clatter. Their horses shied violently, one of them stumbling directly into a shallow pit, pitching its rider head first into the dirt. Emmett was already moving, using the porch columns as cover, firing not to kill, but to confuse, to sow panic. He was a rancher, not a gunfighter. He knew he couldn't win a stand-up fight, but he knew his land. Every dip, every rock, every shadow was an ally. He dove off the side of the porch, rolling behind the water trough as bullets chewed the wood where he'd been standing. He could hear Kellerman shouting orders, trying to restore control, but his men were spooked. They were hunters, not soldiers. They were used to ambushes and unfair fights, not a battlefield that fought back. One of them, trying to circle around the house, rode straight for the deep trench. Emmett heard the crack of breaking branches, a human scream, and the awful, sickening sound of a horse falling. One less gun to worry about. Briggs was the real threat. The tracker moved with a silent, deadly grace, slipping through the chaos, his pale eyes searching for an angle. He was using the fading light, moving from shadow to shadow, getting closer. Emmett knew he had to draw him out. He broke cover, running in a low crouch towards the barn. It was a calculated risk. A bullet tugged at his sleeve, another whined past his ear. He made it, crashing through the barn door and slamming it shut behind him. He scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, his lungs burning. He peered through a crack in the boards. He saw Briggs creeping towards the barn, a pistol in each hand. The man was a predator, closing in for the kill. Kellerman was back on his feet, his face a mask of fury, directing the one remaining bounty hunter to cover the front. They had him pinned. But they didn't know the barn like he did. They didn't know about the loose floorboard in the loft, right above the main door, or the old, heavy block and tackle that hung from the central beam, its rope coiled and waiting. Sarah had always told him to fix it. He was glad he never had. He crept over to the rope, his knife in his hand. He listened. The barn door creaked open below. A shadow slipped inside. Briggs. Emmett held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment, the fate of his wife's legacy hanging on a single frayed rope. Briggs moved into the center of the barn, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He was cautious, scanning the empty stalls, his pistols held ready. He didn't look up. That was his mistake. Emmett sawed at the thick rope with his knife. The fibers groaned, then snapped. The heavy iron block and tackle plummeted from the rafters. Briggs looked up a fraction of a second too late. He tried to dive away, but the block caught him a glancing blow on the shoulder and head, sending him sprawling into the dirt, stunned and disarmed. Before Briggs could recover, Emmett was down the ladder. He kicked the pistols away and hauled the groggy tracker to his feet. He shoved the barrel of his rifle into Briggs's back. "Walk!" he growled. He forced him out the main door into the open. Kellerman and the last bounty hunter were right there, their guns leveled. "Let him go, Sloan!" Kellerman shouted. "You drop your guns first, Marshal!" Emmett yelled back, keeping Briggs between him and them. "Or your star witness loses the ability to testify." Kellerman's face was a storm of indecision. He needed Briggs. Briggs was the only one who could connect Sarah Sloan to the underground network. Without him, the whole investigation fell apart. But Briggs was also the one who had betrayed that network, a fact Emmett was now gambling his life on. "What are you talking about, Sloan?" Kellerman blustered, but there was a new uncertainty in his eyes. "Ask him," Emmett said, prodding Briggs with the rifle. "Ask him about the ledger. Ask him about the list of names, the one with his name on it." Briggs went rigid. A choked sound escaped his lips. Kellerman stared at his tracker, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Briggs wasn't just his informant. He was a traitor, playing both sides. The look on Briggs's face was all the confession Kellerman needed. The Marshal's expression hardened, his eyes turning from cold fury to icy resolve. He wasn't a lawman anymore. He was a man cleaning up a mess. He raised his pistol, but he didn't aim at Emmett. He aimed at Briggs. The shot was deafening in the sudden stillness. Briggs collapsed without a sound, a neat hole appearing in the center of his chest. Emmett stared, shocked, as Kellerman coolly holstered his pistol. The last bounty hunter looked just as stunned. "He was a loose end," Kellerman said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Now, it's just you, Sloan." But it wasn't. From the darkness behind the house, a shadow moved. Ayanna. She hadn't run. She had circled back. In her hands, she held not a weapon, but the quilt. She held it up high, letting it catch the faint starlight. It was a banner. A flag. And from the darkness on all sides, other figures began to emerge, silent, watching. Men and women, their faces grim, armed with old rifles, bows, and a quiet determination that was more terrifying than any army. They weren't Apache warriors. They were ranchers, farmers, the ordinary, decent people from the surrounding homesteads, the ones who had traded with Sarah, who had accepted her quiet kindness, who had listened to the whispers on the wind, the people who were part of her network, the rest of the web. Kellerman and his last man were surrounded. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The tables had turned, not with a shootout, but with the silent, undeniable power of a community Sarah had stitched together, one thread at a time. The night was a slow climb of stars, each one appearing sharp above the black ridge. Emmett rode with Ayanna beside him, their horses carrying them steady along a trail only she seemed to know. Behind them, the ranch was quiet. Kellerman and his last man had been disarmed, bound, and left for the territorial rangers to find, along with Sarah's ledger. Justice would be slow, but it would be sure. The network of ranchers had promised that. They had promised to see it through. For Sarah. The land grew stranger with each mile, the air cooler, touched with the resin scent of juniper and stone rubbed smooth by centuries of wind. Ayana led him not to a new town or another safe house, but deep into the heart of the wilderness, to a place no map had ever shown him. The ground dipped suddenly, and the world opened into a hidden valley. It was a sanctuary cupped in the hands of the earth. Stone walls rose sheer on every side, but from their base came the sound of water, an underground spring that fed a crystal-clear pool glowing faintly in the moonlight. Small, sheltered caves dotted the walls, the soft light of fires flickering within them. People moved in the firelight. Families. The names from Sarah's ledger, the ones who had vanished. They were here. They were safe. This was it, the heart of the web, the place Sarah had been protecting all along. Ayana dismounted. An old woman with a face like a beautiful wrinkled map came forward and embraced her. Then she looked at Emmett, her eyes full of a deep, sad wisdom. "You are the weaver's husband," she said. It wasn't a question. "She spoke of you. She said you had a good heart, but your eyes were not yet open." Ayana walked to the pool's edge. She knelt and untied the blood-marked eagle feather from her wrist. She placed it carefully on a damp stone at the water's edge, an offering of thanks, a promise fulfilled. She looked back at Emmett, her eyes clear. "Promise," she said, "not debt." She had delivered him to safety, just as his wife had delivered her. The circle was complete. Emmett walked to the edge of the water. He thought of his wife, of her quiet patience, of the secret world she had built while he was blind to it. In the quiet hum of the spring, surrounded by the lives she had saved, he finally understood her. He said her name aloud, just once. Sarah. Not a prayer, but an acceptance, a recognition. He had buried a wife, but he had found her legacy. He had lost a home, but he had found a family. The town would count him as another man lost to grief in the frontier. But here, in this hidden valley, his wife's story, and now his, was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the untamed West. Every subscription helps us keep these stories alive. And let us know in the comments what you think Emmett should do next. Your support means the world to us.